So we've just got the 4 representatives: Julianne Genter from the Greens Party, Michael Wood, who's about to arrive very shortly from Labour, Tracey Martin from New Zealand First, and Tim Macindoe from National. So welcome all of you. This conference is obviously very timely with where we are poised in the 3-yearly election cycle, and I'm sure that everybody in the audience is very keen to hear your comments about where your respective party positions are around the electric vehicle transition that we're in, and the timeframes, initiatives, whatever, and however you might describe them. We're going to have, as we've had throughout the day, just each panellist spending about a little over 5 minutes, something like that, to just outline as they'd like to just what their respective positions are. And then I'm sure all of you, as you've been so good during the day, will have those Slido questions coming thick and fast, and we'll have a collective question and answer session right at the end as part of the wrap up. So that's how we'll run it, just as we have throughout the day. And I'm just going to go straight from left to right, and Julianne, you're first, so please, the floor is yours.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. It's wonderful to be here today. This is such a cool event. My name's Julianne Genter. I'm a Member of Parliament for the Green Party. I have been for nearly 6 years now, and I'm the spokesperson for Transport, Health, Sport and Recreation, ACC, Youth, Auckland Issues, Associate Finance, and Climate Change and Building and Housing. And before I got into politics, I worked as an urban and transport planner. And it's safe to say that the Green Party sees electrified transport as a key part of the solution to not only climate change, but cleaner air, healthier, happier cities, cleaner water. There's many, many advantages of switching to electrified transport, and we have been campaigning on action on climate change for several decades now, so you can definitely trust us to keep that high on the agenda in Parliament and potentially in a new progressive government. I didn't come here today. I wanted to come on an electric vehicle, and I did come partway on an electric vehicle. I rode an electric bike that I'm borrowing down to Newmarket train station, and I was about to hop on the electric train, but sadly I missed it by a few minutes, and I ended up having to catch a cab partway here. But it was a Prius. So that's good. And I think that just demonstrates how, when it comes to transport, electric vehicles are more than just electric cars. Transport in our towns and cities, there's an opportunity to make it much more about people. Because while I am very enthusiastic about the role electric cars can play in getting us off fossil fuels for transport, it's also not going to solve our problem of congestion in our cities. So when I think about electric vehicles, I'm not just thinking about personal vehicles, I'm thinking about electric car share cars, I'm thinking about electric trains and trams and buses, and electric bicycles. All of that is going to be part of the solution. So what is the Green Party's transport proposal? We have a fully costed transport plan, and within our transport plan, we, I think, have the most ambitious target for increasing the number of electric vehicles that are available to households and business in New Zealand. And we are committed to central government actually putting more money into ensuring that the fast charge infrastructure is where it needs to go. I want to congratulate Charge.net and all those people in the private sector, Vector, who are investing in charging infrastructure, but I think there is a role that government can play and should be playing, and has really missed the boat on getting ahead of that. We also would of course be using government procurement to increase the number of electric vehicles in New Zealand. The current government has set a target of 1 in 3 by 2021. I think we can do a lot better. I think we should be aiming for closer to 90% by 2021, as some district councils have aimed to do. And of course, the biggest barrier for most households and business is the upfront purchase cost of electric vehicles. And there are things that government can do to change the incentives to make it easier for people to buy an electric vehicle. So how would we do this? In Norway, they had quite a large tax, quite a large component of general sales tax that applied to vehicles, and they removed that GST from electric vehicles, and that helped facilitate the really fast uptake of electric vehicles, in addition to a whole lot of other policies, but that was probably the single most important one. So we said, well, unfortunately, we don't have any big taxes on vehicles in New Zealand, really, but except fringe benefit tax. And about 70 to 80% of all the new vehicles being brought into the country right now are actually company cars. So one way we could do it is to take fringe benefit tax off electric vehicles for 7 years, and that helps create a second-hand market in 3 to 5 years that households can then access. Because if we increase the number of new cars coming in that are electric vehicles, obviously at 3 to 5 years they usually get passed on to the second-hand market, and that's how households can access them. But I think in addition to that, we'll be looking at fuel economy standards and ways that we can also incentivize, am I over 5 minutes?
I don't know,
We can also incentivize electric vehicles and make sure that households are able to purchase them through fuel economy standards, which would make it that much more difficult to bring in really polluting vehicles, and we can use that to incentivize switching to cleaner vehicles. And I think the other part of making electric vehicles more accessible is supporting electric car share at the local council level. And there's a lot central government can do to facilitate local councils in implementing those policies. If, for example, central government or local government are using an electric car share provider as for their own fleet management, then that will suddenly provide the startup base that then households can access electric car share cars, which means, of course, that they'll be spending less on having to own a second car or even any car themselves, and then the electric car just becomes one part of your transport toolkit. So the Green Party is a very comprehensive plan, and you can trust us to keep climate change and clean transport high on the agenda if you give us your party vote.
Kia ora, thank you for the invitation. My name's Tracey Martin. I'm a Member of Parliament for the last 6 years. I'm a list Member of Parliament for New Zealand First, based in Auckland but based in Warkworth. I am the proud owner of a 2011 Nissan Leaf. It is a 10 bar, it has 40,000 K on the clock, and it was brought in from Japan by somebody in Northcote. So I haven't purchased any petrol for, gosh, a long time, and I agree with the comments by Vicky. It's awesome not have to go and buy petrol. So from a New Zealand First perspective, we, because Dennis O'Rourke is actually our transport person, sorry, my spokesperson roles are education, women, communications, broadcasting and IT. But I'm passionate about EVs. So that's one of the reasons why I've worked with Dennis O'Rourke, our transport spokesperson, around some of the thought processes that New Zealand First has had, not only to incentivise the uptake of EVs in New Zealand, but how can we incentivise into certain social demographics? And it's interesting, I think we're all thinking about this from a slightly different place. For me, I had a conversation this morning with a large Japanese investor actually, who has actually been having conversations with the government, trying to get them to incentivise, e.g. subsidising the price of new EVs here in New Zealand. And the conversation I was having was, as I was sitting actually in the middle of South Auckland, just after I was at a Migrants Women's panel, was perhaps we shouldn't be incentivising brand new EVs into New Zealand. Perhaps we should be incentivising our middle and lower socio-demographics around New Zealand to be able to buy second-hand Leafs or second-hand cars, EVs, so that we get a win-win. So that we can remove the cost of petrol that they're having to pay out for at the moment, because what I have found with charging my car at home is that it's made almost no difference at all to my power bill. And yet at the same time we start to switch the very group of people that are going to have the hardest way to gain finance or to save finance to actually start to transition out of fossil fuel vehicles. So that's a conversation I want to have further on. I'm going to tell you first of all, New Zealand First has a few things in policy here. We've also got the lifting of fringe benefit tax for plug-in vehicles, the continuation of the exemption for electric vehicles from road user charges beyond 2020. We want to address the residual vehicle values, the market value of a vehicle at the end of its lease by adjusting depreciation rates for electric vehicles, and regulation to require licensed petrol service stations to have at least one electric plug-in facility within 2 years. Now, that's just a start. We have to go further. And I have to say we were very disappointed in the government's Energy Innovation, Electric Vehicles and Other Matters Amendment Bill. Now, I spoke on that. There was no innovation in it, and it only mentioned electric vehicles twice. And neither of those were very useful. They did give the Auckland Transport the power to let electric vehicle drivers drive in the bus lane if they felt that it wouldn't stop buses from driving in the bus lane. So it wasn't very innovative, and that was a shame. But we want to go into some other conversations, and I think this is what, if I could make any comment, I would say to you that it's really important that you speak to the Parliament. If you're anything to do with this industry, that you speak not just to government, that you speak to the Parliament. That you come and have conversations with every political party there, because you never know who might be in government next time. So some of the questions and some of the conversations that Dennis and I would like to have downstream is not just about how fast are we going to and how can we support fast charging stations, where will they be, how will the rural community be able to participate in this more. The north is reasonably well covered. But actually, as you head over the Bombays and head south, how are we actually going to make sure that we've got this network going across the country? How will we address distance anxiety for those people who will be using second-hand vehicles with only, I think it's 24 watt or whatever, batteries? But the next thing is, what are we going to do with all the fossil fuel cars? Do we have the capacity, and should government be looking at subsidising, one, the training to, and possibly the retrofit of fossil fuel cars into an EV car market? Should government be talking about incentivising new businesses so that as we not only have to recycle fossil fuel cars, what's happening with the batteries? And there's 4 or 5 organisations throughout the world. There's Eaton, Umicore, Acceleron. They're all doing some work around the planet of, if we have a mass of lithium batteries out there, as we transition through, what's going to happen to them out the other side? And if we don't address that now as we start to build the EV market, are we not just leaving a problem so that it ends up over here for the next generation to deal with? One of the ideas that we'd like to have more conversation around is the use that I think it is Eaton, yes, has been doing for reuse for home energy storage, creating battery walls inside garages and wash houses and so on and so forth, when their car batteries have come down to the point where they can still run a small home. And somebody mentioned about that if we have this massive EVs, we're going to have this crisis off our off the power grid. Looking at what NIWA has been doing with the Japanese government around polymers over our windows, and now that we have the battery technology to turn every single pane of glass into energy generation strip on our houses that can now go into, say, a 5-bar or a 4-bar EV battery based on the wash house that will run the house, fully taking that house off the grid. That leaving power back onto the grid for business expansion and for the bus fleet and so on and so forth. These are some of the conversations we should be having, because they have to be led by government. But at the moment, they're not the conversations. The only ones we're having is how fast can we get everybody into an EV. I forgot to mention I'm the Deputy Chair of Globe New Zealand, working on climate change in a cross-party group. So it adds another dimension, but there's all that conversation to have. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name's Tim Macindoe. I'm the National MP for Hamilton West. And as of the 2nd of May this year, when I was appointed by Bill English a Minister, I am the Associate Minister of Transport, as well as the Minister of Customs and the Associate Minister of Education. And Tracey, Julianne and Michael are all working incredibly hard at the moment to ensure that I have one of the shortest ministerial careers in history. But we'll see what happens. Could I begin just by, well, firstly, thank you, Andrew, and thanks to all of you for the opportunity to be here. And as has been mentioned, this is timely given that we are in the thick of an election campaign. I do just want to present an apology from the Honourable Simon Bridges, the Minister of Transport, because this is really his area. As the Associate Minister, I have delegated responsibility primarily for road safety and the regulatory framework, so I guess some of the rules come in under my brief, but I'm very conscious of the fact that I've seen some of the questions you've been asking in the previous forums and thinking, gee, they're pretty tough, so if you don't mind, I may end up needing to phone a friend, and that friend, if I can get hold of Simon, he may be on the other end. But mention has already been made of the fact that as the government, we announced midway through last year our target of 64,000 electric vehicles in the fleet by 2021, so it's a 5-year goal. And we've already had this discussion. In fact, Julianne has already mentioned today that she doesn't feel that that's a particularly ambitious target, and yet I noted that in your program notes it is described as a very ambitious target, and a lot of the focus here is on how we're going to get there. My own sense is that at the time it was set, it was an ambitious target, but I acknowledge the fact that we're doing pretty well, and it's my possibly uneducated assessment that we will certainly reach the target ahead of where we are. After all, it was 1,500, I think, at the time that the target was set. We had the target of 4,000 by the end of this year. Well, here we are effectively 2/3 of the year, and we're already at 4,500. So the maths would indicate that if we continue on that sort of projection, that we're going to get to the target sometime in 2020. And I think the thing that all the candidates who are on stage would acknowledge is that we obviously hope we would do, because it's not controversial that we want to get there as fast as possible and ideally have a very high uptake of EVs right around the country. So, just so that you're aware of some of the things, because the other parties are presenting to you what they would do, we obviously as the government have to be judged to some extent on the decisions we've made and where we're at. So just to ensure that you are aware of it, the government did set policy just a couple of weeks ago when Bill English was on the campaign trail of having the government fleet at 1/3 EVs by 2021. That's a new target. To my mind, it's a pretty good signal to the community at large. We are already one of the most electric vehicle ready and friendly countries in the world. There's no argument at all that EVs are the way of the future. We are strongly committed to supporting the uptake of them. As I say, we've got the target of 64,000 new vehicles. The point of the new policy is to show that the government is determined to lead by example. And of course we've got the government's purchasing power in the public sector in order to do this. So I think you can be pretty confident. I mean, reference has been made to the cost of electric vehicles. Clearly, using the government's purchasing power, we are in a position to be able to do that. No question, of course, that they make good environmental sense, and that's one of the main reasons for going that way. And we do have the great advantage of 85% of the country's electricity being generated from renewable sources. Therefore, the emission reduction benefits are greater with what we're doing than in just about any other country you can think of. There are certain things that we've been looking at doing. One of the ones was that we've announced rule changes last month, which will see heavy electric vehicles exempt from road user charges. We already had light industrial vehicles being exempt. Potentially this allows drivers of electric vehicles to use bus and high occupancy vehicle lanes. From the 1st of September, so we just passed that, heavy EVs therefore are exempt from road user charges, and that will remain the case until they make up 2% of the heavy vehicle fleet in New Zealand. What else can I tell you in these introductory comments? We've made also changes to the rules to enable road controlling authorities such as the Transport Agency and local and regional councils to make bylaws to allow EVs access to special vehicle lanes such as those dedicated to buses and high occupancy vehicles. The fact that EVs are so warmly embraced in New Zealand means that that's contributing to the fact we have more choice in new EVs than ever before. We're seeing an increase in the number of used EV imports that are coming into the country, and I think I'll leave it at there just as a sort of an introductory comment, because no doubt there'll be a few other points to come up in the questions, but thank you for the opportunity to contribute.
Kia ora koutou katoa, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Wood and I'm the transport spokesperson for the Labour Party. Can I just first apologise for being slightly late? I've just spent 75 minutes on a carbon monoxide choked motorway, and so it feels very appropriate to be speaking to you today about sustainable transport and electric vehicles. We've got 2 weeks to go to the election campaign, and along with my colleagues up here, we're doing a lot of these panels here together. You get to know each other pretty well, sometimes steal each other's lines, but we get on pretty well. So can I just acknowledge all of my colleagues who are up here today as well. As Tim said, in some respects, the topic that we're talking about The direction we want to go in isn't terribly politically controversial. Everyone acknowledges the benefits of EV and shifting towards a more electrified sector. The question is how we get there and what the best policy mix is, and from our point of view, developing a truly integrated transport network in New Zealand. And so I just want to step back a little bit and just talk about some of those slightly broader issues, and then offer a couple of comments specifically on where we're going with EVs. The Labour Party's transport policy, which was released about 2 or 3 weeks ago, is to develop a sustainable transport network across New Zealand. That means a network which moves people and freight around our cities and our regions as efficiently as possible and with as little environmental impact as possible. And it's our view that at the moment, if you look at that sort of broad set of objectives, we are going in the wrong direction. I've just given the example of my journey. Our growing cities are becoming ever more congested. It's not just an Auckland disease. Try travelling in Tauranga these days and some of our other growing cities. We've got policy in a number of areas which is going backwards, and if we're talking about the value of running our transport system on clean energy, then nothing could be more evident of that backward step than the decision by KiwiRail to de-electrify the North Island main trunk line. And of course what we know is that across the road transport network, although we know the importance of lowering our emissions, our road transport emissions are actually rising and equal 17% of our overall emissions. Other sectors are doing a pretty good job of keeping them down. We're not succeeding in the road transport space. So what do we do about all of this? Well, Labour's committed to developing an integrated transport network in which we take all of our modes, our roads, our public transport, our heavy rail, a new light rail network in Auckland, and our coastal shipping network, and bringing them together and making sensible investments, not based on a preference for one mode, but based on evidence for what will move people and freight as efficiently and cleanly as possible. And we think that's the way to go. Of course, a big piece of this discussion is the commitment that we have to making real change in respect of climate change. And on that note, I just want to draw people's attention to the fact that we've released our climate change policy today. And this is really relevant to the sector, the electric vehicle sector actually, because what we've announced within that policy is that we will set up an independent climate commission which will give the government advice on binding carbon emissions targets per sector that will be put into legislation. And so this will become relevant in terms of how we make the investments in our land transport sector and sends the right signals in terms of the kinds of investments that we want to make in terms of the electric vehicles sector. And plainly, when we have a sector which runs on an 80 to 90% renewables energy system, you're an incredibly low emissions sector. So we think that's a really important thing generally for our carbon emissions, but sends the right signals in terms of investment in EVs as well. More generally, we just want to up the level of ambition in terms of electric vehicles. We're going to require government agencies to be incredibly active in terms of lowering carbon emissions across the board, and one of the most simple and obvious things we can do is to be giving them a very firm prod around the use of their vehicle fleet. So we don't object to the steps that the government's made in that direction, we just don't think that they are ambitious enough. And it's our goal to ensure that the majority of the government fleet is electric vehicles by 2025, starting with a very clear policy that we will only purchase electric vehicles across the state sector and SOEs from the moment we're in government, unless there are particular exceptional circumstances that suggest another kind of purchase is appropriate. So we think that kind of more ambitious policy is going to get us over the line more quickly. We're all heading in the same direction, but it's going to require some leadership from government. The final thing that I will say is, when I think about my own situation, I've got a young family, 3 kids, and we're going to upgrade our car after this election campaign where I've got a little bit of time. And what would be the things that would make me consider upgrading to an electric vehicle? And it is cost, and it is that sort of range anxiety. So I think one of the key things that we need to work on collaboratively, central government, local government, your sector and other key players, is the infrastructure. I think that is just so important, people having the confidence that they can charge and they're not going to get stuck. So there's a whole range of things there we can work on. We're going to be a more ambitious government in the sector, and it's going to be part of an overall transport strategy that is about efficiency, about being carbon neutral, and about moving people and freight. Can I thank you for your work, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all very much for those statements and policy outlines from each of you. What we'll do now is, whoa, look at that. That Slido's really active for this stage of the Friday afternoon. So I'm going to try and make sure that I pass these around as fairly as I possibly can, albeit I suspect there'll be a fair number of generic ones there, and just looking at it, they're going to be like that. But let's just start at the top. And Tracey, since you're nearest to me, I'll start with you, and that is that first question, and it's down in front.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a conversation that has to be had, you're right. Certainly worthy of consideration and conversation, so happy to take to the next caucus, yeah, good. Absolutely.
Julianne?
Yeah, we've been talking about fuel economy standards that would apply to second-hand vehicles, but I think a fee-based approach would also ensure that ICE vehicles aren't coming in second-hand really cheaply, that the external costs that they're going to impose are imposed up front, so that provides the incentive to be bringing in cleaner and hopefully mostly electric second-hand vehicles from Japan.
We're cautious about leaping to import tariffs, but I think the place where we can go to in this is looking at raising the standards. If we raise the standards, then we make sure that we get the right kind of vehicles coming in for the national vehicle fleet.
I haven't been part of this discussion, but given that Japan and New Zealand are part of the TPP-11, was previously the TPP-12, and we're very keen to get the TPP across the line, I can't see that that would be consistent with where we're going.
That's the problem with the TPP. Yeah.
No. Well,
just saying.
New Zealand depends on trade.
One specifically for you. Second question there. You're right. Can you see it in front of you?
Yeah. So we've been saying, as long as for the last few years, we've been saying that there is no reason why the government shouldn't be prioritising electric vehicles for the Crown limos. The Tesla Model S would have met all the specifications for the Crown limos, and the list price was lower than the list price for the diesel BMWs that the government ended up going with. Of course, we don't know exactly how much they paid for those, but yeah, we would be looking to get electric vehicles for Crown limos ASAP. And personally, if I was Minister of Transport, you could expect to see me using public transport and an electric bike just as often.
Michael, this one for you. Are there any actions that Labor thinks it can take without getting a working group or commission to spend time and taxpayer money on?
Look, none at all. I'm going to set one up this afternoon to determine what I have for lunch tomorrow. Actually, but
can I add to the ingredients?
Enough, I trust that. But look, seriously, this obviously refers to the tax working group that we've proposed to set up. I'm Labor's revenue spokesperson. Happy to speak to this briefly. Look, the bottom line is that the tax system is incredibly important to how our economy and our society works. We don't believe that it is balanced at the moment, and you only need to look at that real estate market out there in Auckland and the social and economic consequences that has. We could come up with a policy on the hoof during an election campaign. Okay, maybe people would like that or maybe they wouldn't. We actually want to do this properly. That means getting the experts around the table, it means listening to the public, and it means developing a coherent tax system that is fair, that brings in the tax revenue that we need and sends the right investment signals. I think that's a principled approach to take this issue, and that's why it's what we've taken.
It is a very high trust sort of requirement that you're making the voters, though.
That's right, but Tim, I guess the difference is that at the last election, after the last election, your government did bring in a capital gains tax, a 2-year bright line test, and you didn't tell anyone about it before the election. We're saying that we will clearly and transparently have this process, and the recommendations will come out, and we'll make decisions based on that.
Tracey, let's take that question for you.
Yep.
Not all service stations, or you can see it there.
Yeah, I can. Certainly, you can't bring in legislation and then put people out of business on your legislation. I mean, it's not smart. So that's a conversation downstream. We obviously want to incentivise through legislation that we spread the charging stations, but there's going to have to be a conversation about, if the state's going to legislate, how is the state going to support for the delivery of?
And one for all of you.
Yeah.
And Tim, I might get you to start on that one. So to the top there, what year will your party end? And I imagine that that's relating to fossil fuel car sales.
Yeah. Yes.
Many countries have goals between 2025 and 2040.
We haven't set a year for that to happen. I mean, we are obviously keen to move in that direction, and I think it is going to happen quite naturally, but we haven't set a year for it.
Michael?
We don't have a position on putting a ban in place, but we're looking at interest with those countries in the Northern Hemisphere who have. Obviously that's going to have a huge impact on the international market, and I think will lead smaller players like New Zealand closer and closer to a point where effectively EVs are the only option. We'll keep an open mind on it though.
I neglected to say it in my opening statement, but the Green Party has set a goal of no new ICE vehicles sold in New Zealand by 2030. And I think we can do it. Why not? I mean, other countries in Europe are doing it. Absolutely, we can make this happen. And it's vitally important that government takes the lead on supporting this transition. That's the role that government has to play. It's going to happen eventually, but it's happening way too slowly right now, and government needs to be there to make it easier to do the right thing.
So New Zealand First doesn't have a target. I think we're more along the lines of what Michael is saying. There's going to come a tipping point, but at this stage the caucus hasn't set that specific target.
Okay, the next question in the top there. The Morgan Foundation think that the true market value of CO2 in the ETS could be $150 per tonne. It is capped at 25. Who will remove the cap on ETS prices?
We're going to remove the ETS.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to announce our full climate policy this Sunday, but I can say we have been saying since before the last election that the ETS isn't working, and that what we need to do is have a clear, transparent carbon tax that sets a clear line so that people have predictability. I mean, the issue with the market-based mechanism is that it's very unpredictable, and it makes it harder for businesses and households to make those long-term investment decisions when they're buying, investing in capital or machinery or cars or everything else. So let's just have a clear, transparent carbon tax. We'll be setting it not at 150 a tonne, but that's where we're going to have to end up. So at least we'll have a clear line going there.
I think, sorry if I just interject, I think the MOTU report, if somebody's interested in that, go and have a look at the MOTU report that was put out by a couple of academics from Victoria University. That was the side effect of the Vivid report that Globe New Zealand commissioned. There's a internal carbon pricing mechanism in there, and I think that's probably where we're going to end up.
The priorities for Labor are firstly developing an all sectors ETS. So at the moment we've got agriculture sitting out. We've announced today that we will bring agriculture into the ETS pretty gently at first so they can ease their way in, but we've got to have an all sectors ETS. The second key policy is around carbon budgeting and an politically independent climate commission which will help us to set those targets. That's what the UK has done, and it's been one of the key reasons why they've been able to drive down their emissions at the same time as ours have been going up. I think in time the cap will need to be lifted. It's not our priority right at the moment, but again, we'll keep an open mind on that.
I guess the fundamental difference between us and the other parties on that is, I mean, clearly we are the government, so the ETS as it is at the moment is government policy. We are not going to bring the primary producing sector into the ETS until such time, and this is some way down the track, that it wouldn't put them at a significant competitive disadvantage. They are, after all, the backbone of the New Zealand economy, and we are not going to put them at that competitive disadvantage. What we are doing is funding research into reducing emissions through better pasture modification, that sort of thing, because we believe that that is a better way for us to contribute through the primary sector.
Tim, I'm going to double back round to you just purely and simply because I think Seven's got the most likes all day from my memory. So, could you
is there a number on? Oh, up there. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Fine.
And they were after a yes or no, but
well, there's been a review on this. I can't give a yes or no because ultimately that'll be a cabinet decision. And there's been a review. It'll obviously be considered in the near future. But I'm sorry, I can't preempt a cabinet decision.
now let's go down to one that's common for you all. Do you offset? Oh, where'd you go? Do you offset your air travel emissions? If not, why not?
Yes, all the Green Party MPs use our personal money to offset all of our emissions from air travel, and we have for as long as I've been in Parliament, probably well before that.
Can I just, how do you do that? How does it work?
How do we do it? We calculate how many flights we've taken for the year, and we're given a bill, and we've got an agreement with the caucus that all of us are going to pay that. We have different, we have a choice about who we offset with. So different MPs use different offsetting schemes because some want to, we don't all use the same one. I don't know. Some people have like personal attachment to a particular local native forest, say permanent forest, and others are using the same one that is the highest ranked by what was previously the Kyoto Protocol certified offsets.
My answer is no. And only because I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah, you can do that.
It's interesting. I mean, the two major airlines in New Zealand now have that as an option when you do your online booking, and it's actually, and I think I'm right in saying this, the price seems to have dropped dramatically. I remember once upon a time it used to feel like a flat $10, whereas now it's very much on the K's travelled, and no doubt the true calculation of the average yields on their flights and then the emissions that you're offsetting. It's interesting. Anyway, Michael.
Yeah, I always have my personal flights. I'm a relatively new MP. Since coming into my parliamentary role, it's just never been something I've thought of or has been put forward to me, but it's a good point and I'll think about it.
And I have to say no, and that's primarily because I hardly ever make my own flight bookings.
Well, I don't make my own flight bookings, but I just get a summary. So I'm just going to tell you guys so you can do this too. You can take it back to your
Thank you,
pocket. All MPs can do it. You just get a summary from the travel office about your flights, and then you send that to the offsetters, and they calculate how much you owe, and then you just pay it. I pay it like 4 times a year.
Cool.
I'm going to turn a few of these particularly directed at you two. You'll never talk to me again if I keep firing them at you, and probably nor the rest of the panellists, because I won't be asking them any questions. But look, you know, I mean, the ruck exemption sits in law at the moment, so I think it's a relevant question for all of you.
Yeah.
What's the plan for the ruck exemption post 2021? And let's start with that one at least. Tracey.
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Sorry, that's the road user charges,
Oh,
the exemption that exists at the moment for electric vehicles.
Well, there's got to come to a tipping point. So there's got to come to a tipping point. But I'm sorry, I'm not up to play on what that tipping point is. But we're obviously going to have to transition to road user charges onto electric vehicles at some stage to continue the maintenance on our roads that we drive on.
Yeah, my preference would actually be to use the money that's currently used through the RUG exemption to subsidize upfront purchase cost of EVs. You already get an advantage in terms of not having to buy petrol, and in the long term, we are going to have to find a way for electric vehicles to pay for the maintenance and upkeep in new roads. So I think it would be much fairer and more transparent if we didn't use that money for the RUC exemption on RUC, but rather used it to make it easier for people to buy electric vehicles.
So you're saying take it away?
Well, I'm saying to put it onto the purchase price of the vehicles rather than having it be an exemption for how much you drive. And really, I know people who do pay RUC because they have diesel vehicles. They say it's really easy. It's not that difficult. I think the sooner that we make it the same for everyone using the roads in terms of paying for the actual road, the better off we're going to be. But we do want to make it easier for people to buy electric vehicles.
We're pretty open on this one. It's one of those policies that we think is sort of useful, helpful a little bit at the margins. I don't see it being a massive driver of a shift towards EV. If you think about the kind of capital outlay at the beginning, the relatively small change you get from that exemption, we don't know that it's a huge benefit, but we're open-minded. If the evidence shows in the next couple of years that it's having an impact, we'd be open to keeping it.
I suppose since it's the 2021 end point on it at the moment, I can understand that might give a degree of regulatory uncertainty, but you've got to remember that this is an incentive, not a penalty. It's not as if in going back to the way things were that this would come as any great surprise. It's just an incentive in the time being. Our general approach has been to keep trying to put in place the incentives to drive the type of change that is being desired, and I can't predict with absolute certainty what would happen post-2021, but it would be under discussion. I'm not sure. I'd be very interested to hear from whoever put the question forward as to how significant you think that regulatory uncertainty is. Is it possible to get that? Because that's useful feedback for us to take away from here.
Somebody might call you afterwards, Tim, and give that response.
I mean, it's a very genuine invitation. Let me know just how big an issue that is.
Let's go to that second question there, and that is New Zealand's the only OECD country that does not have vehicle fuel efficiency standards. Comments about how your respective parties might tackle that issue, if in fact you would at all?
Happy to start. We absolutely believe that we should. We think it's a joke that we don't at the moment. There's sort of an argument about the regulatory burden, but what's not taken into account is the significant negative externalities of having non-fuel efficient vehicles in our fleet in terms of the environmental impact, in terms of the impact on productivity as well. So we think it's just common sense. If the Australians have seen fit to do it, we're smarter than them, and we'd go down that track too.
Although, to be fair, it wasn't Helen Clark's government that considered it and rejected it back in 2006, 2007.
We've
That's
moved
kind of a shame.
on. We've moved
Kind of
on.
a shame we didn't do it then. We totally support it, obviously, and I saw there's another question for me about subsidising EVs, so I might combine my answer there. So we said we take fringe benefit tax off EVs for 7 years, and I totally accept the point that in some ways it's helping people who can already afford to buy new cars. But I think the point is we want the subsidy to be between car purchases, not subsidising cars at the expense of other things. And so that's why our focus is on something like that, where companies are buying cars anyway. If we provide that incentive for them to buy an electric vehicle if they can, then they do. And then we create that secondhand market of more affordable electric vehicles that, you know, more average households can afford. A fee-based system, in addition to fuel economy standards, would put a price, basically you'd put an extra charge on the most polluting, the least efficient vehicles, and that is a fiscally neutral mechanism which you then recycle into rebates on efficient vehicles, and electric vehicles would be eligible for that.
Tracey or Tim, do you want to make a comment on those fuel?
No, I'm sorry, I can't. It's not my portfolio area, so I apologise. I can't make a comment.
And the question has disappeared from the screen, but I noted the hashtag #OldCrapCars, and that clearly is one of the issues. And this is not a new thing. You'll know that the average age of the fleet in New Zealand is 14 years. And given that we're a country that is wholly dependent on importing cars, obviously we'd like to see a more modern fleet, because there are safety benefits as well as fuel efficiency, carbon emissions, all the rest of it. But I'm sorry, I have now lost the question. I've slightly lost my drift as well.
Well, look, I think...
And I'm sorry, I can't see that screen down there.
I think we'll call it a day there. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
That's not a very auspicious way to finish it.
That's been tweeted out.
I was wondering if I was going to have to answer number one. I think.
I'm letting you
A
off
little
the hook
bit
there.
flippant.
But look, thank you all very much. I know that you're under an enormously gruelling schedule at the moment, and I'm sure that everybody in the audience appreciates your attendance and your forthrightness with the answers.
Right.
Could everybody join me in
Thank
thanking
you.
please?
Thanks.
It's just a small shame that we didn't get to that.